The high-end Lagos restaurant buzzed with chatter, its walls drenched in elegance, the air perfumed with money and pretense. Chief Damien Okoye, towering in stature and arrogance, walked in with a kind of entitlement that made heads turn. Clad in a custom navy kaftan stitched with gold embroidery, he didn't need an introduction. Everyone knew the man who crushed his competitors, bought out enemies, and laughed in the face of emotion. He was seated at a center table, surrounded by fawning influencers and business hangers-on. Waiters bowed, managers hovered. With a casual flick of the wrist, he ordered the rarest wine on the list and meals in excess. He lit a cigar, unbothered by the no smoking sign, and launched into one of his infamous rants, mocking politicians who owed him favors, laughing about poor people who needed luck to survive, and boasting that even in recession, he remained untouched. His words, loud and laced with venom, bounced around the room, drawing stares from some and fake laughter from others, too afraid to confront him. But when the waiter returned with the card machine, and he inserted his platinum business card, the first red flag blinked silently. Declined. Damien scoffed. Try again, idiot. The waiter did. Still declined. The whispers began. People leaned closer. The manager tried another POS machine. A third attempt declined. The laughter started slowly, like a ripple, but then came a woman's voice from the next table. I'll be the man they bluff all along, followed by chuckles and low murmurs of mockery. Damien's hands shook slightly as he fumbled for a second card, then a third. One by one, failure. And with each decline, the weight of his pride crumbled. Sweat formed under his armpits, despite the AC blowing cold. His once commanding voice faded to a grunt. People began recording. Even the waiters, once nervous, now wore sly smirks. A man who once dictated deals in billions now sat cornered by a 4-digit transaction he couldn't clear. No one stepped forward. Not even the politicians he'd paid off. They looked away, ashamed or satisfied. It was hard to tell. Then came a small voice, barely audible at first. I can help. Everyone turned. A little girl, no more than 10, dressed in a faded purple dress and dusty school sandals, stepped toward the table with a small prepaid card in hand. Her eyes were wide, but not afraid. Uncle, you can use mine, she said softly. The room gasped. The girl's bravery silenced the restaurant. Damien, stunned beyond belief, looked at her like she was a ghost. A child, clearly poor, was offering to help him. The same man who had once mocked poverty like a disease. The manager choked on his own laughter. Phones were now fully up, capturing every second. Damien didn't speak. He couldn't. His pride was bleeding. And the little girl? She just stood there, holding her tiny card in both hands, unaware that in that moment, she was stronger than the man the whole city once feared. The footage spread like wildfire. Before midnight, it was trending on Nigerian social media as Billionaire begs to swipe. Meme pages reposted it with captions like from CEO to POS, and Ada saves the economy. The internet was merciless. Online blogs speculated that Damien's businesses had collapsed. YouTubers did exposés linking him to past debt scandals. Former rivals he'd humiliated in board meetings released cryptic tweets, laughing at karma. But what hurt most was how people closest to him reacted. His girlfriend, the glamorous Ifeoma, with whom he had paraded red carpets and magazine covers, posted a video pretending to cry into tissue, then burst into laughter. Imagine dating someone whose card can't pay for pasta. Gotta beg. His phone buzzed endlessly with messages, but none in support. Instead, they were bankers requesting urgent repayments, political associates cutting ties, and old enemies gloating like vultures over a dying lion. The mockery wasn't just virtual. It seeped into the real world like poison. At gas stations, street hawkers shouted "Ogaswipe now" whenever they saw his car. Even the security men at his office began whispering when he walked past. At a high-profile event he was invited to speak at weeks before, the organizers quietly dropped his name from the list. On the rare occasion he did show up somewhere, people stared at him like he was a museum piece. A walking fall from grace. The powerful, untouchable billionaire had become a national joke. It was not just the humiliation that burned Damien, it was the speed. He had built his empire over 25 years, yet within a single night, the weight of a little girl's kindness and a piece of failed plastic had toppled everything. At home, the mockery continued. His younger brother, Chuka, who managed one of Damien's smaller companies, openly challenged him. "You for just collect the Pekin card. E for save your face small." Damien snapped and almost struck him. But the damage was done. No one feared him anymore. His staff walked slower around him. His cook served his food cold. The dogs he once commanded wouldn't even wag tails anymore. His mansion, once a fortress of dominance, now felt like a haunted palace. Every mirror he looked into mocked him. Every silence in the hallway screamed failure. And no matter how much he tried to push the memory away, that little girl's innocent eyes haunted him, not because she embarrassed him, but because she did what no one else dared. She helped him when he was down, without shame, without fear. The next morning, Damien walked into the boardroom of his flagship company, Lion Shield Holdings, trying to salvage what was left. He dressed in a dark suit, masking his fear under designer sunglasses. But even before he opened the doors, he could sense the shift. The air was thick with betrayal. Board members avoided eye contact. His once loyal assistant barely acknowledged him. He took his seat at the head of the mahogany table and cleared his throat. "Let's talk strategy," he said. But the reply was silence. And then it began, slow, calculated mutiny. His CFO, Mr. Aluko, a man he had sponsored through 2 overseas programs, raised a damning audit report. "There are irregularities in the last fiscal quarter, sir. The SEC is already investigating." Another board member, a woman Damien had promoted after she lost her husband, spoke coldly. "We believe a change in leadership is best for investor confidence." One by one, the knives came out, and they twisted deep. Some accused him of embezzlement. Others said he was mentally unfit to lead. A vote of no confidence was called, and the count was swift. 8-1. The final blow was delivered with no emotion. Damien was out, removed from the very company he built with sweat and fire. No one stood up for him. The betrayal was surgical. As he stood to leave, he looked at their faces. Not one of them showed remorse. These were people he had fed, defended, and enriched. Now they laughed behind stiff lips, watching him fall like a discarded god. Outside the boardroom, the receptionist, who once stood up when he passed, remained seated, chewing gum. "Sorry, sir, the company driver is unavailable," she said with an empty smile. Damien walked out into the Lagos, sun alone. No car, no chauffeur, just the heat of a road and the echo of mockery in his ears. And as the building behind him loomed like a grave he once ruled over, he realized the worst part wasn't losing power. It was realizing he had no one left. Damien stormed into the Lion Shield Annex office the next day, bitter and broken from his ousting at the boardroom. His heart pounded with rage and confusion. He was a man without command, roaming hallways he used to own. He had fired men for less than eye contact, yet now he received none. The corridors were filled with a strange silence, broken only by whispers that stopped when he entered. He needed someone to bark at, anyone to make feel small. His pride, though wounded, still needed blood to feed on. As he turned the corner leading to his private quarters, he noticed a woman struggling with a mop and bucket. She was hunched over, moving slowly as she cleaned the tiled floor. "Why are you cleaning here during business hours?" he barked. The woman, clearly frail, looked up but didn't speak. "Can't you hear me?" he shouted again, his voice echoing through the corridor. "Are you deaf or just stupid?" She winced at his words, but bowed her head in apology. "Sorry, sir," she murmured. "I'm trying to finish quickly before the elevator traffic begins." But that only enraged him more. "You people are the reason this place stinks," Damien continued, his voice rising. "Dragging diseases into my company, slow as snails, and always waiting to be pitted." A passing secretary froze, unsure whether to interrupt or disappear. The woman, Nosi, nodded quietly, hands trembling as she clutched the mop tighter. Her face was pale, hair hidden beneath a worn scarf. Her arms shook not from fear alone, but from exhaustion and medication she could barely afford. Every word Damien flung at her sliced deeper than he knew. She could feel blood rushing to her ears, not out of anger, but out of the growing illness she had hidden for months. Cancer was eating her alive from within, and yet here she was, on her feet, enduring insult from the same man her daughter had once tried to help. What Damien didn't know, what would haunt him soon, was that this was not just any cleaner. She was Ada's mother, the very same girl who had offered her card during his humiliation at the restaurant. A woman with no pride left, who had already buried her dignity to survive another day. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy, a painful kind of survival. As Damien stormed past her muttering curses, Ngozi leaned heavily on the mop, her knees wobbling under her weight. Her breathing had grown short, but she forced herself to remain upright. Falling now would only invite more disgrace. She blinked back tears, not because she had been humiliated, she was used to that, but because she had felt a sharp jolt in her ribs, a pain that warned her something was shifting inside. Her time might be running out. She needed to get back home. Ada would be waiting, probably boiling Gary water and lighting a candle so they wouldn't eat in darkness. Her little girl, always smiling, always pretending not to notice how sick she had become. Ngozi took a moment to steady her breath before moving again. One step, then another. She still had 3 floors to mop and a cancer appointment to miss, all before nightfall. She could endure a billionaire's cruelty. What she feared now was leaving her daughter alone in a world this cruel. Ada skipped carefully over puddles as she walked the long road home from school, her school bag hanging by one torn strap and her black shoes scuffed from wear. The sun above Lagos was merciless, yet she walked with quiet energy, used to the heat, used to hunger. Her classmates often laughed at her uniform, faded and patched in odd places, but Ada rarely responded. What would be the point? She had learned from a young age that words could hurt more than sticks. But silence, if carried properly, could carry dignity. When she got home, she found the small metal pot still on the cold stove. No food. She frowned slightly, not in anger, but in calculation. How many cups of Gary did they have left? Could she stretch it with more water? She dropped her bag, lit the tiny kerosene stove, and began boiling what little they had. Still no sign of Mama. That worried her. Her mother was usually home before her, even if she walked slowly from the office. Lately, Ada had noticed her getting weaker. Her cough had worsened. Her steps were shorter. And some nights, she would hear her mother crying in the bathroom when she thought Ada was asleep. The room they lived in wasn't much, one mattress on the floor, a wooden chair near the window, and a cracked mirror hanging crookedly by the wall. But Ada kept it clean. She arranged her books by the corner, always dusted the surfaces, and had even taped a cutout of a star above her sleeping space. Dream high, it said in faded marker. She believed it, even if her mother didn't. Life had taught her how to be old while still being a child. She knew how to portion food. She knew which neighbors to borrow from and which ones to avoid. And most of all, she knew how to smile when her stomach rumbled, to pretend she wasn't hungry so her mother would eat. But that day, as she stirred the Gary and waited for her mother, she felt a strange heaviness. Something was off. Her eyes drifted toward her small wallet. Inside it was her most prized possession, the prepaid card. She had loaded it with birthday money from years ago. When she had offered it to the man in the restaurant, she hadn't understood the noise it would cause. She just didn't like seeing someone embarrassed. It was instinct to help, even if she had nothing. Hours passed before Ngozi finally stumbled home. Ada rushed to her side, but her mother barely managed to smile. "Sorry I'm late," she whispered, lowering herself onto the mattress. Ada helped her remove her shoes, noticing how pale her mother's feet had become. She tried to hide her worry. "I made Gary," she said, her voice bright. "I even added sugar." Her mother chuckled softly, coughing in the process. They ate together in silence. Ada watched every bite her mother took, making sure she chewed slowly, didn't choke. When they finished, Ada laid beside her, clutching her hand in the dark. "Don't worry," she whispered. "One day we'll be rich." Her mother didn't respond. She simply held her tighter. Ada didn't know that her mother had collapsed earlier that day. She didn't know how close she had come to passing out in front of that heartless man. All she knew was that her mother was tired. And so she stayed awake a little longer, just in case she needed anything in the night. Chief Damien sat in his grand living room, once a space of pride and luxury, now a tomb of silence and shame. The chandeliers still sparkled. The marble still gleamed. But something had shifted. His staff moved like shadows. The house was cold, not from lack of power, but from the absence of respect. The laughter that once filled his halls, fueled by artificial friends and gold-digging mistresses, was gone. Ifioma, his girlfriend of 5 years, had packed her things and left 2 days after the viral video incident. Not quietly, either. "I can't be dating a broke philanthropist," she had said, flinging her wigs into designer suitcases. "I date powerful men. You're now a Twitter punchline." Her heels clicked as she walked out, slamming the door behind her. Damien hadn't called her back. What would he even say? He had spent millions on her. Bought her a Lexus she never learned to drive. Paid off her siblings' rent. Now she treated him like Ebola. He sat with a bottle of whiskey, replaying her words in his mind. Philanthropist. As if kindness was a disease. His relatives weren't any better. Chuka, his younger brother, now walked around the house with a sense of ownership, already positioning himself as the new family head. He brought in strange women. Used Damien's name to host parties behind his back. "Big bro, calm down," Chuka would say. "You've done your time. Let me show you how to enjoy small before Dem drag the whole company from your hand finish." Damien almost slapped him once. But what stopped him wasn't decency. It was exhaustion. Fighting was no longer worth it. Even his own staff mocked him. His cook no longer greeted him. His personal driver made excuses not to drive him to public places. The maids whispered behind his back, assuming he didn't hear. They talked about his clothes, how he had stopped wearing new ones. They laughed about his shoes, that they now had creases. The fall from glory was real. He couldn't hide it anymore. And worse, he didn't know how to rebuild from it. He poured another glass of whiskey and stared at the TV. The same video playing again. The little girl offering her card. Again and again. Her face burned into his brain. Who was she? Why had she helped him? What kind of upbringing teaches a child to reach out to a stranger in public humiliation? Something about her stuck. Her small hand, her wide eyes, her quiet bravery. He hated that she had seen him at his weakest. But he hated more that she had done what no adult did. He had mocked her appearance that day, assumed she was a beggar's child. But she hadn't asked for anything. She only gave. That night, he stayed up drinking, unable to sleep. The woman he shouted at in the office kept flashing in his mind. The girl with the card. His fallen empire. It all blended into a storm of guilt and confusion. And somewhere deep in his broken pride, something began to shift. Slowly, reluctantly, but undeniably. Ngozi lay on the thin mattress, her breath shallow, her body burning with fever yet cold to the touch. Her limbs ached in a way that suggested something deeper than fatigue. It was pain rooted in the marrow, in the core of her being, a pain that whispered of slow decay. She had ignored the signs for months, the night sweats, the persistent cough, the weight loss. She couldn't afford the luxury of being sick. There was rent to pay, Ada's school fees to manage. Medications were a distant dream. The price of blood tests alone was half a month's wage. That morning, she had tried to push herself out of bed, but her knees buckled. Her vision blurred. When she opened her eyes again, hours had passed. Ada had already left for school. No one had noticed. Her body refused to move the way it used to. She dragged herself up, her hands trembling as she reached for the wall to balance. She tried to sweep, tried to prepare something for her daughter, but even lifting a broom made her chest burn with fire. When Ada returned home that day, she found her mother slumped against the wall, face pale and lips dry. She dropped her bag and rushed to her, calling out softly at first, then louder when her mother didn't respond immediately. Ngozi stirred weakly, offering a faint smile to calm her daughter. I'm fine, she whispered, her voice cracking. Just a little tired. But Ada was no longer a naive child. She saw the truth in her mother's eyes. The dark circles. The shallow breathing. She cried as she fetched water, soaked a cloth, and dabbed her mother's forehead. When the fever refused to break, she ran to a neighbor's room, begging for help. But the neighbor was harsh. Una never pay last month light bill. A beg no carry your walla come here. Ada returned defeated. That night, with a candle burning low and the sound of passing cars outside their window, Ada held her mother's hand, whispering stories, singing old songs, anything to make her smile. It was the longest night of her life. In the following days, Ngozi's condition worsened. She couldn't return to work, and her phone buzzed with calls from the office asking why she missed her cleaning shift. She ignored them all. She didn't want to lose the job, but she also didn't want to collapse and die on the floor of a hallway. Ada took on more responsibility, fetching water, cooking, running errands. Their landlord came knocking the third evening. His voice was gruff. Madam, this is the third warning. I go give you people till month end. If you no pay, you day go. He didn't care for her pale skin or the way she clutched her side when she coughed. When he left, Ada curled beside her again. She didn't cry this time. Her face was hardened. She whispered, I'll find a way, Mummy. I promise. But inside, the fear was eating her alive. What if her mother didn't wake up tomorrow? What if she was left alone? And what if the man they helped, that proud, powerful man, never remembered them again? Damien hadn't stepped out in days. But when he finally did, hoping to show face at a low-key networking party hosted by an old business associate, the air felt heavier. He arrived dressed sharply, trying to exude some of his former aura. The valet recognized him, hesitated, then took his keys, more out of pity than respect. Inside, the conversations paused for a moment as people turned to look at him. The laughter dropped, then resumed, slightly louder, more exaggerated. Whispers spread like wildfire. That's in the card guy, someone murmured. He heard it. He tried to ignore it. He walked confidently toward the drinks table, poured himself wine, and greeted a few former allies. Most gave him polite smiles. A few turned their backs. One of them, Mr. Ogby, a man Damien had once kicked out of a meeting for being 5 minutes late, walked past with a smirk and muttered just loud enough, I didn't bring my POS machine tonight. Hope you brought your little friend. A burst of laughter followed from a nearby group. Damien stiffened. His fingers clenched the wine glass so hard it nearly broke. But he forced a smile, nodded once, and stepped away. He couldn't show weakness. Not here. Not again. But the humiliation deepened when the host of the event walked to the mic and announced the evening's sponsors. Damien's name had been on the list just weeks ago. Tonight, not even mentioned. Instead, the mic crackled as they praised his biggest competitor, a man whose company he once threatened with acquisition. People clapped, cameras flashed. Damien sat quietly, forcing sips of wine, his stomach burning. A woman in red walked past, glanced at him, then turned away laughing. That used to be Chief Okoye, she whispered. Now he's Chief Overdraft. The laughter stabbed deeper than a knife. And no one came to defend him. Not one of the people he'd once empowered, gifted cars, funded businesses, or hosted in his home. They all turned their backs, like dogs smelling the weakness of a fallen lion. He left early, walking past the crowd with his head lowered. Outside, the valet delayed in returning his car, serving others first. Damien stood in the night air, ignored, like a common man. Someone even handed him their parking ticket by mistake, assuming he worked there. He didn't respond. He just stood, swallowing the pain. On the ride home, he didn't turn on the music. He stared out the window as Lagos lights blurred past. In his mind, he saw the little girl's face again. Ada, her quiet strength, her fearless kindness, the only person who hadn't laughed, who hadn't mocked. And in a twisted, painful irony, she was the one who had paid for his dignity, while the world now stripped him of it piece by piece. He didn't know who she was, but he had to find her, not for pride, not for gratitude, but because she represented the only part of his memory that didn't feel like shame. Damien arrived at the annex office building early the next morning, dressed down and unshaven, something unlike him. He hadn't come to work. He had come searching, not for profit or power, but for clarity. He asked for the cleaning department records. His voice, though once commanding, was now softer. The receptionist raised an eyebrow but gave him the list. It was old handwritten, stained with biro scribbles. He scanned the names until one struck him. Ngozi's. The name was too familiar to ignore. He remembered it. It was the name of the woman he had shouted at in the hallway days earlier. The cleaner who looked too tired to breathe. He remembered her face now. And he remembered Ada's face. They had the same eyes. Cold realization washed over him. The little girl who offered her card was the daughter of the woman I insulted. The weight of the truth nearly knocked him off his feet. His heart pounded with shame and disbelief. He had shouted at a dying woman, and her child, the same child, had stood up for him when the world mocked. He got her address from the office records and drove straight to the neighborhood listed. It was a slum near Ibut Meta, streets flooded with potholes, open gutters, and children playing barefoot beside refuse heaps. He parked and asked a food vendor for directions. "You mean Madame Ngozi?" the woman replied. "She never come out since last week. Dem say she's sick well. Damien's throat dried. He walked briskly to the rusty gate and knocked. No one answered. He knocked again, this time louder. A few moments later, the door creaked open and Ada appeared. She wore a faded t-shirt, her hair in loose puffs, eyes alert. When she saw him, she froze. Not in fear, in confusion. "Uncle?" she asked softly. Damien knelt slowly. He couldn't speak. He looked into her eyes and nodded. "Yes, it's me. I came to check on you and your mummy." Inside, the room smelled faintly of soap and kerosene. Ngozi lay on the bed, eyes closed, breathing shallow. Damien stood over her, unsure whether to speak or disappear. But when her eyes fluttered open and she saw him, her body tensed. "You," she whispered hoarsely. "What do you want?" Her voice was laced with distrust, anger, and exhaustion. Damien lowered himself to the floor beside her mattress. "Forgive me," he said, for the first time in his life, not out of strategy, but from his soul. "I didn't know. I didn't see you. I was blinded by pride." Ngozi stared at him, eyes sharp. "And what do you see now?" she asked. His reply was broken. "The woman whose daughter saved my soul." In that moment, the silence between them was louder than words. Ada sat by her mother, unsure what this meant. But deep inside her, a strange hope began to bloom. Not because a billionaire had come to their house, but because for the first time, someone powerful looked like he truly saw them. Damien sat alone in the courtroom gallery, surrounded not by strangers, but by former business partners who now eyed him with disdain. His once powerful company, Lion Shield Holdings, was on the brink of ruin. He was being investigated for corporate misappropriation and internal fraud, the result of years of trusting the wrong people. But this wasn't just legal drama. This was warfare. His name, once uttered in awe, now sounded like a bad investment. Lawyers he'd paid fortunes to represent him now crossed the courtroom floor to serve papers against him. Men he helped climb the business ladder now gave damning testimonies, faking concern while plunging the knife deeper into his back. The court clerks barely looked him in the eye. The judge regarded him as another disgraced big man. Cameras outside flashed relentlessly as journalists shouted questions about his bankruptcy and fraud charges. Each step he took was a new humiliation. And the sickening part? He knew this wasn't the end, not yet. There was more disgrace waiting around every corner. The betrayal was systematic. His CFO, a looko, whom he had trusted with unrestricted access to the company's finances, had created a hidden chain of shell companies siphoning funds. Damien had been too arrogant to check. His legal counsel, Barrister Tund, who used to bow and call him master strategist, was now testifying for the prosecution, claiming he had warned Damien repeatedly of financial misconduct. And then there was his right-hand woman, Anita, the polished executive assistant who handled mergers and signed confidential documents. She was now a hostile witness, spinning every transaction to point to Damien as the mastermind behind the rot. His hands trembled in court when the evidence was presented: doctored documents, false approvals, secret meeting logs. He had built an empire on loyalty, but none of it was real. The people he had lifted from poverty now cast stones without flinching. Some even laughed when the judge denied his bail extension. He had expected opposition. What he didn't expect was silence from everyone he once called friend. Back home, his mansion echoed like a hollow tomb. He would wake up drenched in sweat, sometimes crying in his sleep. Pride no longer comforted him. There was nothing left to boast about. Cars had been repossessed, properties seized, accounts frozen. He couldn't even access his private health insurance to continue treatment for his back pains. The humiliation wasn't in losing money. It was in being forgotten. Powerful men who once begged for his time now acted like they never knew him. On the streets, young men called him Billionaire POS. On blogs, he was a caricature of failure. But in those moments of despair, one face refused to leave his mind: Ada's. Her voice, her hand, her eyes, a stranger's kindness. She and her mother were the only ones who saw him, not the powerful man, but the human beneath. And as the world closed in, that memory became the only anchor keeping him from complete collapse. Damien had never felt this type of pull toward anything outside business, but after discovering Ada and Ngozi's situation, he found himself driving back to their neighborhood almost daily. He didn't enter the house at first. He would sit in his car down the street, watching from a distance. Ada would fetch water. Ngozi would sit in the doorway, wrapped in a faded shawl, coughing with each breath. The sight did something strange to him. It stripped away his anger. It silenced the noise in his mind. In those moments, he wasn't Chief Damien Okoye, disgraced billionaire. He was just a man bearing witness to a kind of suffering deeper than his own. It humbled him. One afternoon, he parked nearby and waited until Ada left for school. Then he approached the house quietly and left an envelope tucked into the side of the door. It had 50,000 Nigerian nairas in cash and a note that simply read, "For medicine. No strings." The next day, he saw them at a nearby pharmacy. The relief in Ngozi's face, the way she placed her trembling hand on Ada's shoulder, it made his throat tighten. Still, he kept his distance. Pride wouldn't let him show up uninvited. Not yet. As the days passed, Damien started to split his life into two. By day, he was the man under siege, attending court, facing betrayal, being mocked in public. But in the evenings, he became something else entirely: a silent guardian. He began leaving food by their door. One night, he paid off their rent in full and left a note with the landlord. Don't mention who. He didn't want gratitude. He didn't feel he deserved it. But what he couldn't understand was why he felt drawn to them. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps it was the way Ada still smiled through everything. Perhaps it was the way Ngozi never begged, even when she had every reason to. He watched Ada escort her mother to a local clinic one morning, and something in him cracked. She held her mother's hand the entire walk. So small, so fragile, yet carrying so much weight. Damien sat in his car, hands trembling on the steering wheel, as tears clouded his vision. His own life had been built on cruelty and fear. Yet here they were, clinging to love in the middle of ruin. Ngozi, on her part, was wary. She noticed the sudden food deliveries, the anonymous money, the unexpected pharmacy credit. She suspected Damien, but said nothing. Her pride wouldn't allow her to ask, and her illness left her too weak to investigate. But her heart was torn. She remembered his cruelty. His words still echoed in her head. She had once cursed him quietly when she collapsed in the office toilet. And yet, this same man was helping. He never spoke. He never asked for attention. But she saw the signs. And in the quiet moments, when Ada was asleep and her pain subsided just enough, she would look at the bag of medicine by the table and wonder, what is broken in a man that makes him both cruel and kind? And could he ever be trusted? That night, the sky over Lagos rumbled with distant thunder. The small room felt colder than usual. Ngozi lay in bed, her breathing labored, her eyes dim. Ada had just finished mopping the floor and was boiling hot water to press her mother's chest. Damien had come earlier that day, bringing medicine and bread, but had stayed outside. He hadn't entered the house. He stood by the doorway, hands in his pockets, watching Ada tend to her mother with the gentle grace of a nurse. When he turned to leave, Ngozi had called out faintly, "Come." Her voice was weak, but firm. He hesitated, then stepped inside slowly. The room smelled of menthol balm and worn-out curtains. Ada looked up, her eyes hopeful. Damien lowered himself into the wooden chair beside the bed. Ngozi turned her head to look at him. Her eyes were heavy with something that was not anger, not yet peace either, just fatigue, and a strange acceptance. "Chief Damien," she whispered, her voice ragged. "I don't know if you're helping us because you feel guilty, or if this is some kind of punishment you've set for yourself." Damien opened his mouth to reply, but she shook her head. "Let me finish," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have long. I feel it. This sickness, it's digging into my bones." Damien's eyes dropped to the floor. She continued, "My daughter, Ada, she is stronger than me, smarter than me, kinder than me, but she is still a child." She turned her head slowly toward the girl. "If I die, please don't let her be alone. Please, Damien, don't let her be swallowed by the world." Her voice cracked on that final plea. "She has nobody else." The silence that followed was unbearable. Damien felt something deep inside him shatter, something old, something ugly. He nodded slowly, unable to speak. His pride, his arrogance, his entire identity as a ruthless man, all of it began to collapse in that moment. He reached forward, took her frail hand, and whispered, "I promise." It was the first time in years he had made a promise without profit attached. Ngozi nodded faintly, a single tear slipping down her cheek. Ada, still quiet, placed her tiny hand over both of theirs. The bond that formed between them in that moment had no name. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't family. It was something deeper, a thread of human survival woven through suffering. Damien left that night broken in a new way, not by scandal, not by betrayal, but by love, a kind he had never known. And as he stepped out into the night, the thunder cracked loud overhead. It was as if the sky itself had just witnessed something sacred, the fall of a giant, not into ruin, but into humanity. Damien returned to the streets not as a billionaire, not even as a businessman, but as a man who had shed his armor of pride. His movements were slower now, quieter. He no longer barked instructions or walked like the air parted for him. Instead, he waited in queues, walked with slouched shoulders, and accepted scorn in silence. People noticed the change. Some thought it was strategy. Others thought it was madness. But those who had seen power up close recognized it for what it was, collapse. True collapse. One morning at a petrol station, he was recognized by a group of younger men waiting to refill their jerrycans. One of them sneered, "Omo, now this man way card declined for that restaurant. I'll be you on swipe for fuel too." The others erupted into laughter. Damien didn't respond. He didn't even flinch. He simply looked down at his shoes and waited his turn. The same man who once made oil tycoons tremble now stood quietly in public disgrace. The staff at his old company had become crueler by the week. News of his court cases had emboldened them. Some refused to answer his calls. Others leaked old voice notes of him yelling at employees, mocking their poverty, their families, their dreams. It made the rounds on WhatsApp. Everywhere he went, someone had something to say. He used to drive convoy. Look at him now using Uber. Nahem talk say poor people are lazy. Who lazy now? It wasn't just the strangers who mocked. Even his security men had changed. They no longer stood straight when he walked in. One even rolled his eyes when Damien asked for a gate to be opened. It was painful, but he didn't react. His humiliation had become so familiar it no longer burned like it once did. And strangely, in that silence, he found a kind of clarity. He had spent so much of his life trying to be feared that he had forgotten what it meant to be human. Now that no one feared him, he was beginning to see the world with honest eyes. But humility didn't taste sweet. It tasted like gravel in his mouth. He watched a video of himself from 2 years ago, barking orders at an entire village council over a land dispute. Back then, he thought strength was about how loud you could yell, how much you could seize. Now, he sat on a plastic chair in a hospital corridor, holding a paper bag of food for a woman who had once mopped his floors. Life had rearranged him, and the people closest to him, the ones who used to gather around his pool, drink his whiskey, wear his name like armor, had all vanished. But it was Ada's voice that rang loudest in his head. "You're not a bad man," she had once said. "You were just sad." That sentence haunted him. Sadness had worn many masks in his life: arrogance, control, coldness. But now, stripped of all of them, he could finally feel something true, and painful, and necessary. The waiting area at the general hospital was packed, humid, and thick with the scent of disinfectant, sweat, and desperation. Damien stood in line behind coughing children and women with babies strapped to their backs, holding a faded envelope of lab results. For Nosi, she had collapsed again that morning, this time bleeding from her gums and vomiting bile. It had taken every ounce of strength to get her into a taxi. There was no ambulance, no special bed, no priority list. She was number 47 on the file queue. Damien had to learn how to fight for her without power. He had to beg nurses, bribe interns, and plead with hospital security to move her up the list. But even that wasn't enough. He was told she would need a series of injections, blood work, scans, and a possible surgery. The total estimate was more than 700,000 Nigerian nairas, money Damien didn't have immediate access to. His accounts were still frozen. His name was still red-flagged by major banks. The nurse behind the counter, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, looked at him with a smirk and said, "You be the man way card decline ABI? Try use Ada card again." That moment almost broke him. He turned, quietly walked out into the parking lot, and stood under the hospital's dusty mango tree, fists clenched. The shame was unbearable. But when he returned inside, his face was calm. He handed over a Rolex from his wrist, his last symbol of wealth. The nurse took it without hesitation. "Bring the receipt later," she said. The doctors began the tests. Nosi lay in a narrow, stained bed with a thin 4-line dripping into her wrist. She didn't open her eyes much, but when she did, she would squeeze Damien's hand once or twice. She never complained. Even as pain ripped through her body, she didn't moan. She simply endured. And every hour she stayed alive became a war won. Damien refused to leave her side. He slept on hospital benches, sometimes using his folded blazer as a pillow. The same blazer he once wore to company boardrooms, now soaked with his own sweat and the smell of disinfectant. The other patients began to whisper. Some recognized him. Some assumed he was just another man who had run out of luck. But a few, just a few, saw something in his eyes that made them stop judging. One nurse, a younger woman named Amaka, began to soften toward him. She watched how he wiped Ngosi's mouth, how he fed her pap with a spoon, how he didn't look away when her body convulsed in the night. She approached him one morning and said quietly, "She's strong. But she won't survive if she keeps carrying the burden of tomorrow. You have to carry it for her now." That sentence buried itself in his chest. He nodded without replying. And from that day on, he began to treat Nosi not like a duty, but like family. Not because he was in love, but because he understood that survival isn't romantic. It's about choosing someone and refusing to let them go under, even if the whole world is laughing at you. Damien entered the courtroom with no lawyer beside him. His new counsel, a desperate fresh graduate he hired when the others abandoned him, had called in sick. He didn't blame him. The courtroom felt like a battlefield soaked in poison. Across the aisle sat his former business associates, clean-shaven, well-dressed, and smiling like men who had already won. Barrister Tund, once Damien's most trusted legal advisor, now stood with the opposition. His voice, once calm and loyal, now dripped with rehearsed precision as he tore Damien's reputation apart with every sentence. Chief Okoye authorized unauthorized wire transfers. Chief Okoye knowingly misled investors. Chief Okoye approved inflated construction budgets, each point, though fabricated, was laced with just enough truth to sting. Damien tried to protest at one point, rising from his seat. The judge warned him to sit. "You'll get your turn," she said, her voice cold and unbending. As the hearing progressed, more testimonies came in. Videos, emails, recordings of meetings taken without his consent. Every tool used against him had once been built to protect him. Anita, his old executive assistant, stood up next. She looked at him once, just once, and then began to read a statement that stabbed deeper than any betrayal he had ever known. She claimed he had forced her to falsify documents, that he screamed at her daily, that he built a workplace culture of fear and fraud. Damien could barely breathe. He wanted to scream, to ask her why, to remind her of the time he paid her rent when her father was sick, of how he gave her a promotion when no one else trusted her. But she didn't care. None of them did. This was survival. They had seen the ship sinking, and instead of swimming alongside him, they jumped into yachts with his enemies. One man even cried on the stand, saying, "He made me feel worthless. I had to take a stand." Damien wanted to laugh. "These were the people I built," he thought, "and now they're burying me to stay afloat." By the time the hearing ended, Damien sat hunched on the bench, not out of fear, but from exhaustion. The reporters hounded him outside the courtroom. Microphones were shoved into his face. "Sir, do you still deny the fraud charges? Chief, how does it feel to be abandoned by your board? Do you plan to declare bankruptcy officially?" He said nothing. He just kept walking. The camera flashes felt like bullets. But in his mind, he was somewhere else. He was back in the hospital room, watching Ada whisper into her mother's ear, telling her stories about rainbows and success. That's what kept him moving. Not the hope of clearing his name. That was gone. What remained was the promise he made to a dying woman: protect her daughter. And no amount of mockery, betrayal, or disgrace was going to stop him from keeping it. Ada sat by her mother's bedside, gently brushing a warm towel across Ngosi's forehead. The hospital room was quiet except for the beeping of a borrowed blood pressure monitor and the rustle of nurses' shoes in the hallway. Damien had gone to buy medicine, but Ada refused to leave. She had become a fixture at the hospital. At only 10, she had mastered the routines of care: when to give her mother sips of water, how to whisper songs when the pain returned, how to hold her hand through the night so she wouldn't drift off afraid. The other patients and nurses watched her with awe. She wasn't loud or boastful. She simply existed like a flame, soft, warm, but enduring. Some nights she would sit on the floor, knees pulled to her chest, whispering prayers she barely understood. "Please God, just let her stay," she'd murmur. "I'll be good. I won't complain. Just let her stay." But what made Ada's strength most profound was not her silence, but her refusal to hate. Despite what Damien had done, the humiliation, the past cruelty to her mother, she never turned bitter. She saw beyond the broken man. She saw the change. When Damien would return to the hospital after being mocked at court or scorned on the street, Ada would look up, smile faintly, and say, "Thank you for coming." Not once did she ask him why. Not once did she rub in his failure. She carried her own pain quietly, and yet she offered him comfort without asking for anything back. One day, after a particularly grueling court session, Damien entered the hospital with red eyes and trembling hands. Ada offered him a sachet of pure water and said, "You look tired, Uncle. Rest first. We'll be okay." That moment shattered something in him. He knelt before her, hiding his face in his palms, unable to stop the tears. Ada simply sat beside him, resting her head on his shoulder, like they had always known each other. No press, no audience, just broken people trying to survive together. But outside the hospital walls, the world was cruel. On her way to buy bread one morning, Ada passed a group of schoolchildren who recognized her. "Look, it's the POS girl," one of them shouted. "Maybe she'll pay our school fees." Another chimed in, "How much is in your rich man's card today?" The laughter stung, but Ada didn't flinch. She looked at them, smiled, and replied softly, "If you ever need help, I'll still give." Then she walked away. She didn't cry until she reached the hospital corridor. She buried her face in her mother's blanket, sobbing quietly. She wasn't strong because she didn't feel pain. She was strong because she kept showing up, for her mother, for herself, and for a man the world had already discarded. In a world full of cruelty, Ada became the only light that never went out. Damien sat at the edge of the hospital bench, counting the last stack of Naira notes he had in his possession. It wasn't enough. He had sold nearly everything. His third property was gone, his last luxury car had been traded weeks ago, and even the wristwatch he wore on his most iconic magazine cover now sat in a pawnshop window. All for one thing, keeping Ngozi alive. The doctors had informed him of a new round of injections that might buy her time. The medicine was experimental and imported, but it gave a sliver of hope. That was all he needed. He had once spent 10 times that amount on a single champagne bottle to impress a foreign investor. Now he stood in a public hospital corridor, sweaty, hollow-eyed, and bartering with a pharmacist for a payment plan. "Please," he said, his voice shaking. "Just give me 3 days. I swear I'll bring the rest." The pharmacist, a soft-spoken man who had seen him deteriorate over the months, nodded reluctantly. 3 days, Chief. After that, no credit. He walked home under the harsh sun, too weak to call a taxi. On the way, a vendor shouted, "Chief, you know day drive again." A few street boys joined in, clapping mockingly. One threw a bottle cap in his direction. Damien said nothing. He had learned silence. The man who once sued journalists for bad headlines now walked past years with his head bowed. His feet were sore, his back ached, but he didn't stop. He reached home, peeled off his soaked shirt, and sat at the edge of his mattress, hands over his face. Ada arrived later, carrying 2 loaves of bread and a bottle of Zobo. "I used my school money," she said softly. "You can pay it back later." Damien looked at her, unsure how to respond. What could he say to a child offering him sustenance? He took the Zobo and said, "Thank you." That night, as Ngozi slept, Ada placed a blanket over Damien, where he had slumped in the chair. "You can cry, you know," she whispered. "Even rich people can cry." But Damien didn't cry. He just nodded and stared at the woman sleeping in the bed, the woman whose life he was now willing to burn his own for. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the miracle began. On the 5th morning after the injections, Ngozi opened her eyes fully. Her voice, though weak, was clearer. Her fever had dropped. The coughing subsided. Damien called the doctor, who ran several tests. "Her body is responding," he said, surprised. "It's small progress, but it's real." Damien sat on the hospital bench afterward, stunned. It wasn't a full recovery. Not yet. But it was something. Something powerful. That night, when he told Ada, the girl ran to her mother's bedside and whispered, "You're not going anywhere, Mummy. You're staying. You promised." Ngozi smiled for the first time in weeks. And in that smile, Damien saw what true wealth looked like. Not boardroom victories, not private jets, not Forbes rankings. It was breath, warmth, life. It was holding on when everyone else lets go. For the first time in years, hope entered the room and didn't leave. Recovery was slow, but it came, like water dripping from a broken pipe into a dry bucket. Every morning brought a small victory. Ngozi could sit up now. She could eat porridge without vomiting. Her voice, once a faint whisper, began to hold weight again. She still winced when moving, but her body was slowly rebuilding. Damien arranged for a nurse to visit them twice a week. He borrowed money from a former classmate, who agreed reluctantly, with one condition, that Damien never speak of the transaction publicly. "If anyone knows I helped you, I lose my reputation," the man said. Damien agreed. He had no reputation left anyway. He spent his days cleaning, cooking, and researching free clinics and cancer nutrition remedies. The mansion he once called home now existed only in pictures. Here, in this one-room flat with peeling paint and 3 plastic chairs, he learned something his wealth had never taught him: how to serve without expecting applause. Ada returned to school, with a small scholarship from a kind-hearted teacher who had read their story on a local blog. She resumed classes with a warm bag and second-hand textbooks. The students still whispered. Some still mocked. But Ada had grown past their laughter. She had seen pain up close. Death had brushed her mother's skin. Nothing frightened her anymore. At night, she would sit beside Damien, watching him peel yam or scrub floors, and she'd tell him about school. "We learned about blood types today," she said once. "Mine is O positive. Mummy says it means I'm a giver." Damien smiled faintly. "You are," he replied. "More than anyone I've ever known." Ngozi, listening from the mattress, blinked away tears. She didn't say it out loud, but she knew what Damien was becoming. Not a replacement for Ada's father, but a man who had chosen to stay. And, in her world, that meant everything. But the world outside hadn't forgotten. The court cases dragged on. The ridicule never fully stopped. Damien would still hear whispers when he stood in bank queues. His name, once a door opener, now triggered suspicion. But he didn't fight anymore. He didn't protest. His eyes were softer now. When strangers insulted him, he only smiled. His power was no longer in dominance. It was in restraint. What shocked people most wasn't that he had fallen. It was how he stayed down willingly, carrying someone else on his back. And as Ngozi slowly healed, as Ada continued to grow, Damien knew something sacred had happened to him. He had lost everything the world applauded, and in return he had gained something the world couldn't understand. A purpose that had nothing to do with wealth. A reason to keep waking up. A family born not from blood, but from fire. The rumor that Damien Okoye now lived, like an ordinary man, began to spread in whispers, not among the rich or elite, but among those who once feared or hated him. The story traveled from hospital corridors to food vendor queues, from Okada parks to church prayer meetings. That billionaire? He's the one staying in that one-room flat with a sick woman and her daughter. At first, people didn't believe it. Some said it was a lie. Others laughed it off as punishment. But over time, it became clear. The man who once rolled with 4 SUVs and security escorts now walked the market with a reusable bag. The same man who once bought silence with bribes now offered apologies without hesitation. The mockery didn't end, but it changed form. Now it came with confusion. What's his angle? Is he acting for pity? Is he broke or just crazy? But Damien didn't respond. He no longer needed to be understood. He only needed to keep his promise, the one he made to a dying woman who was now, somehow, surviving. Some of the people who had once spat his name began to take a second look. One day, an elderly man approached him at a local chemist and said, "I used to curse you, Chief. You were not a good man. But now, I see you." It wasn't praise. It was acknowledgement. And that was enough. Damien started volunteering at the hospital clinic 3 days a week. He helped push wheelchairs, donated small items like blood pressure cuffs, even mopped floors. The doctors didn't treat him like a VIP. The patients didn't know who he was. And still, he returned. Over time, even some of his enemies began to soften. His former driver, who once quit and laughed in his face, returned one evening, quietly offering to help him buy water in bulk for Ngozi's treatment. "I hear say she dey get better," he mumbled. Damien simply nodded, no bitterness in his eyes. His reputation was no longer about dominance or dread. It was about constancy. He had stayed. He had not vanished when the cameras turned off. That in itself became its own kind of legacy. But perhaps the greatest shift happened inside the home, within the walls of that small rented room. Ngozi could now walk short distances. She could even sit upright for long periods without needing to lie down. Her laughter, though raspy, returned in moments when Ada told stories from school or teased Damien about how he tied his wrapper too high. They began to feel like a strange, patched-together family. No roles, no titles, just 3 people tethered by suffering, surviving by choice. Ngozi, once a ghost in her own body, began sketching again, something she had given up when illness stole her hands. She drew portraits of Ada. One day, she handed a rough pencil sketch of Damien to him. "You look human here," she said. He smiled. "That's progress." They didn't talk about what he lost. They didn't talk about court cases or scandals. They just talked about things that made them feel real. And for the first time in his adult life, Damien began to feel whole. It wasn't a grand ending. There was no sudden windfall, no secret inheritance, no investor suddenly knocking with a billionaire offer. It was much quieter than that, and more powerful. One evening, Damien walked out of the hospital with Nosi leaning on his arm. They had just received the latest test results. The doctor's voice had been calm, deliberate. "The cancer is regressing," he said. "It's slow, but we're winning." The three of them didn't cry. They just held each other for a long time under the soft glow of the corridor light. That night back at home, Ada danced around their room with bare feet, singing a song she made up on the spot. "My mummy is strong, my mummy is here, my mummy didn't go away." Damien sat on the floor, laughing quietly, watching her spin in circles like joy had never left her body. Nosi watched them both, hand resting over her heart. For all the months of vomiting blood, coughing until she couldn't speak, and praying with her last breath, she had stayed. Not because of medicine, not because of miracles, but because two people had refused to give up on her. Eventually, Damien found a new job, not as a CEO or a boardroom shark, but as a logistics officer for a mid-tier transport company. The owner, once an intern he had mentored years ago, hired him quietly. "No press," Damien had said. "Just work." And work he did. He woke up early, took okadas, logged shipment reports, managed warehouse boys. At first, many mocked him. Imagine Damien Okoye doing offload duty. But he smiled through it. For every laugh, there was now a mouth fed. Ada's school fees were paid on time. Ngosi's medication was consistent. Their rent never delayed. And slowly, society stopped laughing. They began nodding. Respect grew not from fear, but from a realization that Damien had achieved something most powerful men never could. He came back from nothing and stayed humble. He didn't reclaim his throne. He didn't need to. He built something stronger: peace. In the final scene, Damien sat outside their house on a plastic stool, watching Ada braid her mother's hair while they hummed an old highlife tune. It was just after rainfall. The air smelled of wet sand and kerosene. No cameras, no headlines, no crowd. Just a man, a woman, and a little girl who once gave her last card to pay for a stranger in distress. He looked at her, now older, taller, more radiant than ever, and said, "That day at the restaurant, you saved me. Not with money, with dignity." Ada shrugged and replied, "You just needed a little help, that's all." Ngozi smiled, eyes glistening. And with that, they all sat in silence, the kind of silence that doesn't ask for more, the kind of silence that says, "We made it." Not with victory, but with endurance. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel TOCHI Stories for more.